All right, well, let's get started, shall we? So, 5 minutes after, and I'll put this here. Let's be mindful of our time. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. My name is Jason Miller, and I'm a 2010 graduate of what is now the Carter School here at George Mason. Back when I was here, it wasn't even a school, it was still an institute of conflict resolution, and Hazel Hall and all of these new buildings didn't exist yet. So it feels very much like a homecoming, even though this is all new space for me. But welcome to Peace Week. We are here at Peace Week. And as some of you probably know, you've been to other sessions. The theme is Rethinking Peace 2022 and beyond, which is great because, as you'll see with my topic, talking about the Catholic Church, obviously, as Catholics, we say that it's a universal church, it's a global church. So many issues that we care about today in peace and conflict resolution, if you're talking about Ukraine, if you're talking about the refugee crisis, rights, the environment, so many things that the Catholic Church does and works on touches all of these important issues that we're thinking about during this week. And I just wanted to say happy 50th anniversary to George Mason as well. It's really exciting to see all of these changes, as I said, on the Arlington campus. And all this really exciting growth. And yes, I would love some questions. That was the other sort of housekeeping thing I was supposed to mention, and we should have time here. And just also wanted to give a special thank you to Rabbi Mark Gopin, who I've known for a long time now. I was with him in Israel and Palestine on a George Mason trip, and as we told the officials at the airport, yes, in the mornings we were at the yeshiva with our rabbi, which was true. What we didn't tell them was that in the afternoon we were also running all around the West Bank. So a big thank you to him for sponsoring this event. So again, excited to be here. But now that I've given you all the George Mason disclaimers, first question to think about, I was going to say, who am I? But that's the next slide. Some questions to think about during the presentation, and I outlined them in welcome in the Eventbrite where you all signed up. That first, we want to think about how the influence of Catholic bishops are felt in the United States. Why are they in opposition to Pope Francis? And that's a question that maybe you're taken aback. Maybe say, what do you mean? Are they in opposition to Pope Francis? And finally, does this tension between the bishops and Pope Francis mean that the Catholic Church is headed towards schism, separation, if you will? So those are some big, heavy questions, and that's a big conflict, right? Well, who am I besides a George Mason graduate, a Carter School graduate, to try to answer these questions? Well, I have over a decade of experience as a faith-based advocate, organizer, and activist. Spent the last 8.5 years at the Franciscan Action Network, and in March, I started a new job at the Interfaith Alliance, where I'm the Director of Operations and Special Projects. Worked on a wide variety of campaigns with Nuns on the Bus, the Fast for Families Immigration Campaign, the People's Climate March and Movement, many more. I've been published in the Washington Post, The Hill, Religion News Service, Catholic News Agency, a few others. So I have over a decade of working in faith-based advocacy, doing the polar bear plunge, speaking, occasionally getting arrested. And but how did I get here? Well, that's me graduating from what is now the Carter School, is proof I had hair back then, but you can't tell with the cap and gown. And I'm Catholic school educated all up until George Mason. And when I was at John Carroll University in Cleveland, where I completed degrees in both history and religious studies with a concentration in Catholic studies, I took a trip to the US-Mexico border, and that really changed my life and led me to this down this path of advocacy, especially faith-based advocacy. So after college, I did a year with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, working at Catholic Charities in Nashville, in refugee services, helping newly arrived refugees to find jobs. I didn't have any social work experience, but I was basically being a social worker. It was a lot of fun. And then I came to DC, as I said, to work on my master's degree, and have been working in faith-based advocacy ever since. So who's this Pope Francis guy, and why does he create so much controversy, right? So sure, we've all heard of Pope Francis, but maybe some of you really don't know that much about him. Maybe you're Catholic, maybe you were raised Catholic, but like who is this guy? So he's the first Jesuit Pope and the first to take the name Francis, right? After Saint Francis, who we all probably have heard of as well, right? This saint from the 13th century who's sort of known for speaking to animals, right? That's sort of the caricature of Saint Francis. He's much more than that, as Verlia could tell you, but we don't have time to get into that. So, but that's really Pope Francis' inspiration is Saint Francis, where Saint Francis he had a wealthy merchant father, and then he denounced all of his father's wealth, right, to care for the poor, and he started the Franciscan order. So that's Pope Francis, even though he's a Jesuit, which is the Jesuit order of Catholic priests, is Pope Francis's inspiration. And so when we think about Pope Francis, the Pope, right, he's the head of the global Catholic Church. He's essentially a monarch, as we know, right? For centuries, the Pope was in charge of lands and controlled the papal states, right, and fought wars. But the role of the Pope now is, even though he's still a head of state, is very different, right? As a spiritual leader, here he is welcoming Syrian refugees to live at the Vatican. So when we talk about, and they're like literally coming off the plane, right? It's pretty amazing. That's not something you would have seen just even a few decades ago. And so when we talk about the both feet of justice and charity, if you're Catholic, if you're Christian, you have an understanding of that, right? Of the concept of loving God and loving one's neighbor, the both feet of justice and charity. So when you think about caring for the poor, giving them shelter, food, right? That's the foot of charity, as we say. But the foot of justice, right? Those two things need to work together. When you think about advocacy, right? Like I do, working on Capitol Hill, advocating to ensure that the refugee crisis isn't as bad as it is, right? The Pope will tell you that it's been the worst refugee crisis since World War II, advocating to make sure that countries take in more refugees and to end war so we don't create more refugees. That's the foot of charity or of justice. So you have the foot of charity, right? And you have the foot of justice. And Francis is really trying to bring those two ideals together, right? Both by welcoming Syrian refugees, but he also eats in the cafeteria at the Vatican, and he doesn't live in the papal palace. So again, it's taking this idea of being Franciscan, even though he's a Jesuit, of living simple, right? Taking meals with other people, and again, trying to live up those both feet of justice and charity. So, I mean, is that such a controversial idea? Some people think it is because it's so unique in the way that he does these things as a head of state and as the head of the worldwide Catholic Church. So something else that the Pope Francis is doing that is important that we want to talk about is he's emphasizing, it'd be important if I could say that, I'll get some water, the environment. So he wrote what we call an encyclical, right, which is a teaching document. All the popes do it. It's called Laudato Si. And, when he's talking about climate change, he's saying that it's man who has continuously slapped down nature. Now, when do you ever hear a religious leader talk like that, right? We're slapping down nature. He's saying that, he thinks that man has gone too far. And he's happy that there are voices speaking about this. So that's great. But, I saw a survey that the problem is that only 30% of Catholics in the US have even heard of Laudato Si, let alone read it. So, Pope Francis is trying to put an emphasis on the environment. Here he is actually with the Orthodox Patriarch planting a tree. I bet many of you don't even know that from September 1st through October 4th, the Feast of St. Francis, it's called the Season of Creation. And actually when Pope Francis planted this tree, it was part of one of the Season of Creation activities a few years ago. And it's not a Catholic idea. Actually, the Orthodox Patriarch thought of it first. And then the World Council of Churches picked it up. And then Pope Francis in 2015 said, hey, this is a great idea. Catholics should do this too. We should celebrate the Season of Creation. That's almost this radical idea, right? We're borrowing these ideas from other Christian denominations. But Pope Francis talks about other perhaps radical concepts too, if we're talking about these feet of justice and charity, right? So he talks about racial justice. He talks about other cultural touch points, I'll call them, right? Multiple times, and including in this book, which admittedly is on my Kindle waiting to be read, Let Us Dream. Pope Francis, he talks about Black Lives Matter. He talks about the racial justice protests. He talks about George Floyd, and he says that, when he's thinking about the protests about George Floyd, he thinks of the Good Samaritan, where, the movement, meaning Black Lives Matter, essentially didn't pass by the other side of the road when they saw the injuries to human dignity caused by an abuse of power. So, and in the past, right, other times, Pope Francis has spoken out against the sin of racism, and he's prayed for George Floyd. That's in stark contrast to what we're seeing often from U.S. Catholic bishops who have, called the Black Lives Matter movement all sorts of things, including communist and anti-Catholic and anti-Christian and all sorts of things. But here we have Pope Francis speaking favorably to these movements. So, like this Pope Francis guy, is he making all these things up? No, he's not. These come from what we call the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. And you can see them there. Hopefully you can read them in the back, Joe. But we're talking about life and dignity of the human person, including the consistent life ethic. So as the Catholic Church would say, caring for life from the womb to the tomb, if you will. The call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities, option for the poor and vulnerable, dignity of work and rights of workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. So those are lots of big words. Some of them make sense, right? Dignity of work, option for the poor, care for God's creation. But it's not something that Pope Francis originated, right? These are ideas, obviously, that stretch back to the time of Jesus, right? Through the church's tradition, but really became more formally organized starting in the late 19th century with another papal encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which was written by Leo XIII, and it's called On the Rights of Workers. And if you think about the time at the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was happening, and workers were being exploited, right? So this is where the the beginnings of what modern Catholic social teaching really started to begin, right? And that's one of those 7 principles. And it's grown, right, throughout time since then. So Pope Francis he's not making this all up, right? He's just emphasizing parts and pieces of what a lot of people call the church's best kept secret, right? Catholic social teaching. And that's not necessarily something you hear every day in the pews if you're a church-going Catholic. So let's switch gears a little bit, right? So we've talked about Pope Francis. He's this radical guy, right? Some people think that. We understand, right, what the concept of the Eucharist is, right? So if you're Catholic, if you're Christian, if you go to church, if you attend Mass, right, part of that is hearing God's word, but it's also participating in communion, participating in the Eucharist. And Pope Francis, when he is, he travels a lot, right? He was just in Canada a few months ago. He just came back from Kazakhstan. We'll talk about that in a minute. He says, I've never denied communion to anyone. And you say, well, why is he saying this? Well, on the papal plane, right, he gives all of these interviews, and it's when he's sort of at the most off the cuff, but almost when he's at his best as well. And this became an issue, right, because as we know, right, the president, Joe Biden, we probably know most of you probably know that he's Catholic. I will tell an anecdote that, and my wife's not here yet, that we were watching CNN the other night, and Joe Biden was, in London for the Queen's funeral, and he crosses himself, and she said, "Wait a minute, is Joe Biden Catholic?" I said, "Yeah, he is." Actually, I'm glad you're coming to this presentation, because one of the things we'll be talking about is Joe Biden's Catholicity and how that plays a role in public life, right? But what that reminded me of was that even though this is something that I'm thinking a lot about, right? Catholic bishops are thinking a lot about. Everyday Catholics and Americans aren't thinking about the different religions of politicians, right? But we know, right, that the president is Catholic, and he's received lots of criticism for his pro-choice stance. And that's created lots of drama and controversy. And so that's why Pope Francis was asked on the plane, and he says, well, I've never denied communion to anyone, right? Many Catholic bishops in the US are calling for President Biden to not be allowed to receive communion at Mass. And that's up to individual dioceses, right? It depends where he is in the US, whether that applies or not. But the President Biden went to the Vatican. He met with the Pope. He claims that the Pope said he was a good Catholic, and he received communion. Nancy Pelosi also received communion recently at the Vatican, which, she's another Catholic pro-choice politician that has gotten a lot of criticism for her political views, right? And especially the Archbishop out in San Francisco, Corder Leone, who has been very outspoken and critical on this issue. But so that's why there's some tension here, right? You have these prominent Catholic politicians who, it's true, do not, in their public life, right, are going against church teaching. And the US Catholic bishops are upset about that, and essentially they want to punish them. But, Pope Francis has spoken on this before. Not only has he said on the plane, I never denied communion to anyone. He says, the Eucharist is a gift, not a prize for the perfect, but it's nourishment for the weak. So the idea is that, right, as Catholics, as Christians, as people, we all make mistakes, we all sin in different ways. And yet, we are still able to go to communion every week if we so choose. So that is the Pope's stance. But, and this is perhaps where that idea of the conflict between the bishops and the Pope come in. It's a question of, well, who do the bishops think the Eucharist is for, right? So there was, again, lots of controversy. First, when President Biden was elected, Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles, who is the head of what we call the USCCB, so that's the U.S. Bishops Conference in the U.S. As soon as as soon as President Biden was elected, Archbishop Gomez started a task force on President Biden and around the issue of abortion. And they decided, well, we're going to issue this big document, this big statement. You had cardinals, right? Cardinal Burke, who is he's in Italy, I think now he's retired, but he was, he is from the U.S., saying that, to pray for the church in the U.S. And basically subtweeting President Biden, saying that, talking about the sanctity of the Eucharist, right? And the souls of Catholic politicians. And this was not an isolated incident. There were many U.S. bishops who, around the time of the election and then around the time of the inauguration, tweeted similar things to what Cardinal Burke did, right? And so Archbishop Gomez, the head of the USCCB, the head of the U.S. Bishops Conference, said, well, I'm going to create this task force. And, the Vatican said, please don't do that. And there was a Vatican official who said that, they want these bishops to be pastors and not politicians. But 73% of bishops voted to go ahead and write this document on the Eucharist and on Catholics receiving. And so they ended up releasing a document, but it wasn't as perhaps dire as some people thought it would be, right? It didn't necessarily call out Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or anyone else by name. It didn't, explicitly say, oh, if, you're a pro-choice Catholic politician, you shouldn't be receiving communion. But, it did create much, I don't want to use the word scandal, but it did in some way, because they would say that, well, it's President Biden who's creating the scandal, right? But it did create much drama and conflict. And there's a whole host of U.S. Catholic bishops who have now barred President Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and others from receiving communion in their diocese because they are pro-choice politicians. But as Pope Francis says, he's never denied communion to anyone, and it's nourishment for the weak, right? If you will, the body and blood of Jesus Christ himself. It's, Pope Francis's view, it's for all of us. It's not for just those who are worthy. So that's where this great drama is happening. And but it continues because Archbishop Gomez, he started his task force, but it wasn't enough. He sent a letter to President Biden, right, saying that what you're doing is causing confusion. And then on Inauguration Day, he released another statement, speaking specifically to President Biden and his pro-choice views. Meanwhile, the Vatican sent a telegram congratulating the president and encouraging him to pursue policy marked by authentic justice and freedom. And I included this tweet here. Ms. Spicer, I think, is running for Congress, I think in Florida, that feels right. And for all sorts of reasons. And, you know, there, as I said, right, President Biden was at the Vatican. He met with Pope Francis, and her caption was just communism. Like, what does that even mean? So, you know, that's something, right? But at this point, right, the US Catholic bishops have essentially backed themselves into a corner. And because they have doubled down, and they're not listening to the Vatican, who says, you know, please don't start this task force. You know, please, you know, don't do these things. But instead, Archbishop Gomez is saying to Joe Biden, well, you're causing confusion. But, you know, Joe Biden is a politician. Yes, he wears his Catholicism on his sleeve. But, you know, the bishops are the ones who are supposed to be leading the faithful, right? So they should be the ones teaching. And, you know, again, as the Vatican said, be pastors and not politicians. So the next big thing that they're doing is they're spending $28 million. Yes, you heard that right, 28 million to have a in-person event on the Eucharist, a Eucharistic Congress. They're calling it in Indianapolis. So even though they're spending $28 million on it, I think you still have to pay to go. I could be wrong about that, but so that's their next big project, right? And well, I think that's all well and good. You know, I just wonder what else $28 million can do. So we talked about who Pope Francis is, and sort of how Pope Francis and a lot of these US Catholic bishops are butting heads. But who are these bishops, right? Well, there was a survey in 2016. The bishops filled it out themselves. And the average US bishop was a non-Hispanic, white, 65-year-old. In fact, 88% of the bishops are white. And again, this is self-reported. They said that in 2016, nearly half of them watched Fox News. I think something like 4% of them watched MSNBC. I'm not making that up. That was self-reported. Personally, I don't watch either. Cable news is trash. You can quote me on that. But you know, so that's who these guys are, right? They're old white guys. And the National Catholic Register, which is owned by EWTN, which unfortunately we don't have as much time to get into EWTN, which is, you probably know if you were raised Catholic, right? It's that channel that your grandma watches to watch daily mass. But it's also become increasingly anti-Pope Francis in a lot of its news programming that it has. And it's widespread. It has a lot of money, and it's backed by, you know, very powerful and wealthy Catholics. And they also own the National Catholic Register, and it's the most read religious publication by all of these bishops, including the 40% who self-identify as progressive. So there's something like 190 or so bishops in the US. And, you know, while maybe only half are watching Fox News, you know, the vast majority are still reading Catholic publications that, you know, not only tilt to the conservative side, right? They are anti-Pope Francis. So that's concerning. And then before we get into that, so one piece that I wanted to add, where it's in my notes on my slides, but I can't see my notes from here. So we talked a little bit about George Floyd, right? And how there was, just to give one example, right? In Worcester, Massachusetts, a Jesuit grade school that is predominantly minority majority, flew a Black Lives Matter flag. And the bishop there said, you have to stop flying this flag. Black Lives Matter is anti-Catholic. And they said, we're not going to do that. And that's, I think, a common belief among, as we talked about, right, these old white guys who watch Fox News and read the anti-Pope Francis National Catholic Register. They believe that Black Lives Matter is anti-Catholic. And that is their worldview. So that is, and I would suggest that for those who want to read more on the subject, just check out, there's a book on the Black Lives Matter movements and how it relates to Catholicism by Olga Segara. And I can give you the exact title when we're done. But again, so, we had this flashpoint, right, 2 summers ago. What are we seeing now? We're seeing migrants being bused right here to Washington, D.C. They're being bused to New York. They're being flown to Martha's Vineyard. All 3 governors, right, of Florida, Texas, Arizona, they're all Catholic. And I bet, just like you didn't know that it's the season of creation, this week is National Migration Week. And while the USCCB, so the Catholic bishops, released a statement on Migration Week, the USCCB as a whole has not released a statement on these migrants being used as political pawns, essentially. And to their credit, the Florida bishops released a statement after the flight, but they didn't name the governor of Florida by name. So, they have this giant bullhorn that they can be using, and the people listen to the bishops. And, while they should be, in my opinion, speaking out, against police killings and against migrants, being bused all over the place. Instead, they're, worried about flags and, who's receiving communion or not. So there's clearly this tension, right? And it's a church tension, but it's also spilling over into the wider world, right? When it comes to migrants, when it comes to, as we'll see in a minute, the crisis in Ukraine. So now that we've sort of talked a little bit about who are these U.S. Catholic bishops, they're old white guys. What do Americans and Catholics believe? Well, here's a statement for you, right? And PRRI, which is a well-known firm, Robbie Jones, who is a well-known pollster in DC, asked Americans this question: do you believe that it is God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world? So essentially, did, just like God handed, right, the commandments to Moses, did God from upon high create America so European Christians could create this country where we would be, if you will, a shining city on a hill? And 37% of white Catholics believe this, and this is what we would call a tenet of Christian nationalism. We'll explain in a minute exactly what Christian nationalism is if you aren't familiar. So 30% of all Americans believe this, yes, 30% of all Americans believe this, and 55% of that 30%, if you will, believe in what we would call the Great Replacement Theory. Now, the Great Replacement Theory is a white supremacist idea, right, that in the United States, right, and it's true demographically, by 2050 or even earlier, we will become a minority majority country. And there are a lot of white people who are upset about this, right? And so you have this concept of Christian nationalism that varying degrees of Americans believe, including 37% of white Catholics, so over a third. And then there's a chunk of that percentage that also believes essentially in white supremacy. So when you think, oh, maybe these bishops, right, they're just old white guys, what do they know? But there's large portions of America who are also believe in similar things. And in 2018, 6 in 10 white Catholics felt that police killings of Black men were isolated incidents rather than evidence of a profound and legal bias. So if you're wondering why Pope Francis receives this criticism about speaking out against the Black Lives Matter movement, against the killing of George Floyd, why US Catholic bishops aren't doing it, well, 6 in 10 white Catholics agree with the position of these old white guys. So, you know, it's not just these old white guys that are the problem. It's frankly a lot of people in the pews too. So I said this concept, right? Christian nationalism. Are folks familiar with what that is? This idea, right, that there are many Americans who want to merge these sort of Christian and American identities, and that really sort of distorts both Christianity and our Constitution. You know, it's asking for Christianity to sort of be at a privileged place in our society. And it overlaps a lot, as we saw in that public opinion poll, with white supremacy and racial subjugation. And there are Samuel Whitehead and Andrew Perry, who sort of wrote the book, if you will, on the subject. There are 6 criteria that they use to determine whether or not someone's a Christian nationalist. And, you know, that includes this idea, and again, we saw it in this poll, of, you know, that the US is a Christian nation. And that America's success is part of God's plan. So again, this idea, right, it's on the rise in not just in Christian circles, but we see it in our politics as well. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who folks probably know, right, said recently, well, she's a proud Christian nationalist, and then she started selling merch with that on the shirt. So this concept, right, it's not a new one. The people since the beginning of that our country, the United States was founded, believed that, you know, the United States was divinely inspired. But now it is becoming more and more dangerous, frankly. So we've talked a little bit about Archbishop Gomez of LA. And he's essentially promoting Christian nationalism, right? He gave a speech to when all the bishops met, and it received a standing ovation from the bishops. So it's not just Gomez who has these ideas, right? Where he believes that, you know, America historically held a biblical worldview and Judeo-Christian heritage, and that we're losing part of this story, according to Jack Jenkins, who is a reporter for the Religion News Service. And again, this opening speech to all the bishops at their conference, it got a standing ovation. So again, these old white guys, they're concerned, right, that the America that they know, right, they're losing that. But, you know, the America I know, right, is pluralistic. We live in a pluralistic society, and we have a very complicated history, right? Obviously, with slavery, with how we've treated Native peoples. And so I think it's hard to historically say that we've held a biblical worldview if if we look at what's really has happened throughout our history. But this is not Gomez just isn't saying this just to the other bishops, right? He's saying this to all of us. So he's given multiple speeches, right, where he's attacked social justice movements. And he's called them pseudo religions. And that he spoke specifically of the Black Lives Matter movement. So whereas Pope Francis compares them to the Good Samaritan, Archbishop Gomez is concerned, right? Again, this idea that somehow caring for our Black and brown sisters and brothers is communist or Marxist or pseudo religion or anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, all of these sort of buzzwords, in the same way that these two together is just communism, apparently. These social justice movements they're threatening to him, and he believes that they're threatening to our country, the United States, as a whole. But in response to that, Father Brian Massengale, who's up at Fordham, says that, well, what's the real idolatrous pseudo-religion, right? That's white nationalism. And we know that these concepts of Christian nationalism, which Archbishop Gomez he's openly promoting, right? They are related to concepts of white nationalism. And this fear, right, that in people who believe in the Great Replacement theory, this white nationalist idea that white Americans will sort of lose their privileged position in our country. And so when Gomez is saying, oh, we're losing part of the American story, this Judeo-Christian heritage, what exactly does he mean by that? What does he think that we are losing? I really wonder. So switch gears a little bit. I said, we've talked some about the refugee crisis, both in the United States and abroad. We've talked about these big concepts of inter-church conflict, and who is worthy to receive communion, who is not. And I said, well, we talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. And so here we are. So there's this guy, Archbishop Vigano. He is the former ambassador of the Vatican to the US. So I'm not going to get into this, when the Pope came to the US, if anyone remembers Kim Davis, he set up a meeting between Pope Francis and Kim Davis. And he's been involved in these scandals, I think in part because he was such a high-ranking Vatican official, right? That he was part of this financial scandal, and then this controversy over the former Cardinal McCarrick and the sexual abuse crisis. So he's made a name for himself, but where he's really become prominent today is that he is, since then, right, since the 2020 election, appeared virtually at multiple Stop the Steal rallies. And he's a frequent guest on EWTN, who, as we know, is anti-Pope Francis. But he's currently in hiding. No one knows where he is. And besides the fact that he's, promoting this false idea that Donald Trump won the election in 2020, why else does he matter? Well, he also spoke recently at Michael Flynn's Reawaken America rally. And they're holding these across the US. And he's basically brandishing pro-Putin propaganda, right? He's blaming the deep state, and he's blaming NATO and the European Union for triggering the current war and demonizing Russia. He's not only is he anti-migrant, right? He's anti-vaccine, and he's got these pro-Trump takes, but he's also appearing to champion the concept of Ruski Mir, meaning the Russian world. This idea that, the Russian world is not just Russia, it should also include places like Ukraine, and therefore the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just. He even was quoted as saying that, there's hope that the Third Rome, meaning the Russian Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow, may yet lead humanity to a better future. So Archbishop Vigano, who he had already created quite a name for himself, is now in hiding and spouting all of these, not just pro-Trump and pro-Christian nationalist ideas, but pro-Putin. And it's the only comparison I can think of. I don't know if folks have been watching the Ken Burns documentary on PBS about the US and the Holocaust, and there was, in the first episode, a mention of, in the 1930s, there was a Catholic priest called Charles Coughlin, who was essentially pro-Nazi. And he had a radio show that reached a bunch of people. He had a magazine, and one of those magazines was just straight Nazi talking points and anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic talking points. And so the only reference I can think of when we see Vigano releasing these 10,000 word letters where he's pushing pro-Putin propaganda is the same, Charles Coughlin in the 30s, when he was pushing this anti-Semitic Nazi rhetoric. And it's just mind-boggling, right, that you have a former Vatican ambassador to the US that is making these claims, and is apparently good friends with Michael Flynn, who is on currently this Reawaken Christian Nationalism tour of the US. So that's all to say, right? I've touched on all these different pieces and how all these folks are butting heads. But, the first question I asked, well, actually the last question, is the Catholic Church are we headed towards a schism, right? Is the Catholic Church going to split? Is it going to separate? David Gibson, who is he was a reporter, he works now at Fordham University. He tweeted something what he called a soft schism the other day, which I like that, and I'm going to steal that. So there is this bishop in Kazakhstan who is who it only has its Catholic population is 1% of the entire country. And the Pope was actually in Kazakhstan recently for a interfaith conference. And then when he was there, this Bishop Schneider said, "Oh yeah, like the Pope is great. I ate with him, right? We had a meal." And then as soon as he left, Bishop Schneider was criticizing the Pope for taking part in this interfaith conference, saying that, Catholic Church is the only one true religion, and, that's the Pope, again, this idea of confusion, right? That he's going to somehow confuse people by taking part in this interreligious dialogue. So, with friends like that, who needs enemies? Pope Francis doesn't need them. And this is straight from the New York Times. And again, I'm trying not to read straight from the slides, but in 2019, the Pope was given a book, and this is a piece that maybe I saw a few things we can dig into in the questions a little bit. So we have about 20 minutes. That there was not only detractors in the United States to Pope Francis and his agenda, that they were also well-funded. Well, and specifically a well-financed, media-backed American effort to undermine his content. And Francis responded that it's an honor that the Americans attack. But when he was on the plane recently, last summer, he had a health, he had to have surgery. And he said, oh yeah, I heard these rumors that all of these cardinals, right, they were planning a papal conclave, meaning that they were planning on him dying and planning on electing a new pope. And I heard that there were media outlets who were promoting this. And he said, I told them themselves, meaning EWTN, who's on the plane, I told them EWTN themselves, that's the work of the devil. So Francis he thinks it's an honor that Americans attack him, and he believes it's Satan himself who is behind these attacks. And as he said, he prays that there are no schisms, but he's not scared. So I think that in and of itself is the last word. Despite these conflicts, both cultural and religious and international, right? In some ways that, we can pray and hope for the best, but to not be scared. So I'm going to take Pope Francis's recommendation there. And that's it for me. If you want to connect with me, there I am. And we have about 20 minutes to take questions. So I did see a couple hands, so happy to answer any questions. Yeah, Jocelyn, I know.
Waiting so long. Okay, so I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
But I will not dominate this.
Okay, I was going to say, does anyone else have any questions before Jocelyn asks her 5? Don't be shy. Yes.
Yeah, I do have one. Since Pope Francis is so, understanding, non-traditional, do you hear that like the pendulum will swing and the next Pope elected will be like uber conservative?
That's a good question, right? So we see that, right, in politics a lot. And I think the good thing, like, we never know what's going to happen in a papal conclave, right, when they elect a new pope. But the good thing is, and Pope Francis just named some new cardinals, and the majority, I think, thanks for reminding me, I meant to actually include this in my slides, and I didn't. I think 65% were appointed by Pope Francis. So, fingers crossed that, and we know too that, yes, the pendulum can swing, but these cardinals also elected Pope Francis himself. So hopefully with those that elected Pope Francis and the new Pope Francis cardinals, if you will, we'll continue along. How did you put it? This understanding non-traditional path. I like that. So yeah, let's hope and pray, right, that there are no schisms and that we continue along that path.
So
Anyone else before Jocelyn asks her 5 questions? No? Okay, go for it.
So back to the denying communion thing.
Like,
why now? I mean, is it an outgrowth of like, do you think these bishops are being like silently funded by right-wing political actors or something? Or do you think it's in good faith that they're just like, because this is new, right? I mean, the church has been,
well, what is new?
Like, the church has always had these teachings, and yet like
Sure.
this theatrical to like you can't like,
And thank you for, yes. So that's when Archbishop Gomez says to, no, not that one. Back even further. Archbishop Gomez says to Joe Biden, right, you're creating confusion. Well, is he? I mean, I use the anecdote of my wife who's still not here and clearly can't find parking. Right, she didn't even realize Joe Biden was Catholic. But I don't think there's any question about what the Catholic Church's teaching on abortion is, right? Is that really causing confusion? So, you know, are there certainly wealthy Catholic donors who are, are you familiar with Tim Bush and the Napa Institute? You should Google that. And that was a piece that I wanted to get into a little bit more, but you've heard enough from me. So, you know, and that's the other piece, right? Is that, you know, the American Catholic bishops have such a huge megaphone, and because it's the US, right, it's a big country that always plays on the world stage, but also because in the Catholic Church, right, that's where a lot of the money comes from. And it's not necessarily like in politics where you have dark money and super PACs and all that stuff, but there are wealthy conservative Catholics who are putting on events like the Napa Institute and trying to influence the church thinking essentially in that way. So, I mean, the bishops have always been old white guys, right? And, you know, but it is interesting that, you know, they're being so vocal now, and this is what they choose to use their megaphone on when there are so many other things, you know, happening in the world. I see another question back here, and then we'll get back to you. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No,
No, it's not.
Okay, I just have a question. And also, like, I'm not very religious, so like, trying to get my. Like,
That's why I tried to explain
yeah,
things as much as.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like, I understand that like God is like the highest power, that's like the thing, but like because like Pope is the highest like physical, highest like power, I would say, like it or they, is that wrong?
Yeah, like he's the spiritual head of the church, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So like if there is like a separation and like do you think that the US bishop or archbishops will try to find a new like head of
You
power?
hope.
Not necessarily a new pope, but like something equivalent to like the power that the pope has, but for like the US, or do you think they'll kind of relate it to like this like political religious institution or ideology or identity?
You know, and that's why and I'll just keep referring to my slides. I really like this idea, right, of a soft schism. So it's not going to be like in, what was it, 1054 when the East and the West separated. And you had the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, right? And that was a clear division, or the Protestant Reformation, right? Where you had these new churches springing up. You know, it's not like the US bishops are just gonna be like, okay, we're going to create our own church, but they're going to continue to undermine Pope Francis at every opportunity that they can. And that's why there is that concern of, well, you know, who's going to be Pope next, right? And, you know, thankfully, most of those guys don't have a vote in that. And Pope Francis is making sure of that, right? He's maybe even savvier than they are. At least I hope so. And I'm pretty sure. So that's why I think that, you know, you're going to continue to see these divisions, these fault lines, the soft schism, if you will, but it's not like they're going to be like Martin Luther and break off and start their own church. Yes, Connor.
Yes. So I don't know how to say this, like, unlike the Americans, like, do you see any hope basically? Because like I feel like the, you know, Democrat side, it's like, I feel like Hillary Clinton basically picked Tim Kaine, she was Catholic. I feel like the Democrats have been like nominally chasing the Democratic vote for a while. Biden is Catholic, but a lot of people don't know about it. I went to the same high school as him, so I wasn't know that. But like, it's not known, but it seems like Francis is kind of doing it, right? He's sort of like low-key winning the game. Like you said, like he's got like 65% of the cardinals who are.
Yeah, is that what the kids say? He's low-key winning the game? He's more strategic.
He was kind of like, he's like, you can say whatever you want and write your stupid books and be.
Yeah, no, but it's not even if he's saying whatever he wants. He's saying, that's the work of the devil. Like he's calling them out on I'm telling you, the papal flame interviews are the best. That's where he said, who am I to judge? And when talking about LGBTQ people, right? He just like that's when he says all the fun stuff. Yeah. Sorry, did I
like he's like not getting down with them, I guess.
but he's sort of strategically,
So it's
picking
like-
his shots.
So like, do you see any hope for? Again, like you say, Catholic social teaching, Catholic Church is the best kept secret. Do you see any hope in American Catholicism for kind of a pushback against like the bold Trumpy white guys to kind of like push the church back towards like where France is trying to take it?
No. But let me tell you why, right? Because they just released that big study, right, where church attendance is declining all across the board. And traditionally, right, in the Catholic Church, we haven't seen as much of a decrease because of immigration that has helped even out those numbers. But as church attendance continues to decline, we're going to see where the majority of Americans really soon are no longer, let alone go to church. They don't even identify as Christian. So that means that these old white guys are just going to double down because the people in the pews, for the most part, are, aligned with them. And, the ones that don't, right, are the frustrated, they leave, they can't take it anymore. So that's unfortunately no. I don't think that we're gonna see a change in that. Because I heard this anecdotally, I have no idea if it's true, but apparently Pope Francis has a hard time picking bishops in the US because he has these guys, like he doesn't have good prospects. I don't know if that's actually true, but I believe that.
It feels true.
Well,
Correct.
okay, and that's my next question, like, if you were Pope, like,
Sorry, Jocelyn, I did see another hand. Did I see another hand that did you have a second one?
This is a good segue.
Okay,
No.
okay.
no, are you sure?
I'm 100%.
I'm sorry, like,
Never be sorry, nothing actually.
That's why I made Jocelyn come.
do you want, like, if you had an ask for all of us in this room, would you want us to like take over congregations with our radical ways? Or would you or do you want, like, what is your dream?
I don't even know how to answer that. Can we go back to the question and I'll think of I don't know, Leah, what do you got?
Well, remember, there are some congregations that have long since been taken
I
over.
would, that's true. I was waiting for you to say. Well, and in many instances, right, congregations have been, right next door to one, have been taken over the wrong way. This is still recording, isn't it? So, yeah, I think to your point that if folks aren't fed up with what is happening in the Catholic Church, if you can stay, if you can find a good community that meets your needs, great, but it's hard, and I don't blame anyone who has left or who has, doesn't go to church anymore, who goes to a different denomination, is Buddhist, meditates, whatever, right? Like, I don't blame them. But there's got to be, and it's a hard, right? I occupy this strange space of this intersection of politics and religion where, I've been in meetings around the table where I'm the only faith person in the room, and people look at me like expecting me to speak for all people of faith, and I can't do that. But I'm like, well, but let me. And then I've had other faith-based advocates say to me, well, how do you work with all these secular? How do I work with them?
Yeah.
So there's this, it's this really strange space that I occupy, and what's the answer to these guys? There's different ways to try to, carve out your own space and have your own small victories, but it's, the pendulum's going to swing, and we can just hope and pray that, Pope Francis keeps doing the right things from the top and hoping that makes a difference. and doing what we can from the bottom.
Apparently, a majority of voters in the United States do not agree with the Supreme Court decision on abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, politicians seem to be edging away from that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I have, in the months since then, heard more Roman Catholic women say that although they themselves would not have an abortion, they are in favor of choice.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that more too. All the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
So has the church hung its hat too much on
Oh.
one issue?
I mean, oh, you're trying to get me in trouble.
Oh,
But I've already gotten in trouble for this talk, but you know, I think in many ways, right, if we look, I don't want to say historically, but if we go back to the 1970s, right, when Roe v. Wade was first enacted, and then you had this anti-abortion movement. It started with the evangelicals, and then what they really wanted to work on was private schools and school segregation, but that didn't stick, so they switched to abortion. And then they teamed up with the Catholic Church. And while it's true that the Catholic Church, and this is another presentation, while the Catholic Church has always believed that abortion is wrong, the question for the Catholic Church has been, and this has changed throughout history, the idea of when life begins. So I find it very interesting that all of a sudden you have Lindsey Graham saying, well, let's do a 15-week ban. I have seen very conservative Catholic websites come out in support of this. Yeah, Catholic Vote, look it up. You're familiar with Catholic Vote. I almost fell over because Catholic Vote is there. We've talked about how EWTN is anti-Francis and very conservative. Catholic Vote is to the right of that. You know what I mean? And so when they're suddenly supporting Lindsey Graham's ban, I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. Don't Catholics believe that life begins at conception, right? That's from womb to tomb, the consistent life ethic. We talked about that in the principles of Catholic social teaching. So how can they suddenly get behind this bill? Honestly, I didn't understand it. And so has the Catholic Church made an error in just hanging its hat on this one issue, especially in the United States? It's going to be real interesting to see what happens now in a post-Roe world. I don't know that we can answer that question. You know, they gambled, they won for now, and we'll see what happens. Joe?
Question about the Catholic, the American Catholic bishops.
Uh-huh.
How much power do they have? Francis is the first pope from the global south.
Right.
And his church attends the job in this country.
Yes.
But it's growing in the rest of the world.
It's it's growing in places like Africa, Asia, right?
So how much power do the US bishops have? Is it because do we inflate ourselves because we are the best country in the world?
I mean, I
Do
think
they have power?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? It goes back to money, and it goes back to, if you look at, again, cardinals are different from, cardinals are like a step up from bishops, right? And the cardinals are the ones elected. And while the majority of cardinals have now been appointed by Pope Francis, and he's trying to appoint them from other places throughout the world, the global south, other places, they're still disproportionately from not necessarily just the US, but also from Western Europe, right? So, some of it is disproportional when you look at some of those numbers. Some of it is just outsized influence, because in the Catholic Church, this is where a lot of donations come. But yes, thank you for pointing that out, that right, with Pope Francis being from Argentina, being from the global south, you have US Catholic bishops, Bishop Newman from Kansas City, who is head of the USCCB pro-life committee, tried to first, he was also very upset about Joe Biden, and saying that he shouldn't present himself as Catholic. But he also tried to say that Pope Francis doesn't understand the United States, right? It's this idea again of, oh, Pope Francis, right? He's from Argentina, so he must be a communist. He clearly can't understand what's going on here in the US. And not only is that, a little insulting, I think it also plays to the fact that, Pope Francis is doing some 3D chess here and low-key winning the game. Is that the? Yeah, and when, he's getting under people's skin when, they're making comments like that. Yeah.
You kind of alluded to this, but I was just wondering why there wasn't as much like vitriol against Biden when in like 2015 he helped to legalize gay marriage. I mean, I remember the photo of him and Obama with the rainbow flag, everywhere.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that too, because that was, I wanted to talk more about the conservative wealthy Catholic donors. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about LGBTQ issues, and I didn't. It seemed like for a long time that, right, it's like you had the Oberfell case, and gay marriage was legalized in the US, and then it was just like proof it felt like it wasn't an issue anymore, right? And to your point, like there wasn't a lot of, yes, I'm sure the bishops were not happy, and I'm sure they made statements, but like it just didn't, it wasn't as apparent. But what you're seeing now, that's again, it's this pendulum swing, right? And you're seeing diocese after diocese release guidance around gender identity, and they disparagingly call it gender dysmorphia. Saying that, if you're in a Catholic school and you were born with a sex, right, you have to, go to that particular bathroom and you have to present yourself in a certain way. And that's, so it's almost like they've conceded on marriage, because that's civil marriage, right? So they can always say, well, we're never going to do that in the Catholic Church itself. But instead they're, decided to, again, hang their hat on this idea of what a very binary way of thinking about sex and gender. So that's, I wonder if that's sort of a backlash to that decision. It seemed like proof that everyone was okay with it, and now, the list of dioceses that are releasing these, a lot of them harmful guidelines, it's long.
Kind of a double whammy. Do you think the Catholic Church might, exclude? I mean, you said it yourself, church attendance is down.
This is in the Catholic Church everywhere, right? Even more so, even mainline Protestant churches.
Do you think there will be like a time where like there's too much alienation to where kind of like an older country where like it's just the older people and it's slowly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what some of these guys want. They would be happy with a smaller Catholic Church that everyone is in lockstep with their views. They'd be okay with that, even though that's not what we should be thinking about as church, as a community, if you will. I think that right, church attendance is going to continue to decrease, and the folks for the most part that are going to stay are the ones that are going to believe what these guys believe, and that's not good for anyone, right? That's fortunately I think what you're going to see.
Part of that community, I will say that I do love when I see, the flags and the signs. I don't pay attention to the denomination so much, but I do notice when there's a church with, welcoming.
Yeah, with a rainbow flag or a Black Lives Matter sign or a shirt. Yeah, definitely. Jocelyn, more questions?
Yeah. So when you like are doing faith-based advocacy, is your goal to organize Catholics to where the church actually stands? Or is your goal more to just like represent the Catholics that are not insane or both?
Your words, not mine. Again, I think I occupy this really deep space, and this talk isn't about me so much, but I think what's important is, you have these 7 principles of Catholic social teaching, and for the most part, people only know the Catholic Church as having this first one, right? The life and dignity of the human person, which is important, but you have all of these other teachings as well. So for me, it's really about lifting up these other teachings and trying to lift up voices that wouldn't typically be heard when we're working on issues of the environment, of immigration, of rights of workers, things like that.
Is this, I know you kind of touched on this at different points, but like, why is it so much worse here than it is in other countries with more conservative cultures? Like the bishops, like basically.
I mean,
declaring as-
there's other conservative bishops. Oh, cool. We're gonna update iTunes. That's awesome on our smart board. I thought iTunes didn't exist anymore. So there's other conservative bishops, right, that aren't American. And so it's not just an American problem, but it seems like the vast majority of American bishops are conservative. So why is that? Because we had 2 popes previous to Pope Francis who were also conservative and named all of these guys as bishops. And now you have all of these conservative bishops. And you have, but it's not just from the top down, right? The seminary culture is very conservative. So it's guys coming in through the ranks too are very conservative. They're excluding, right? I mean, if you go to the seminary to become a priest, the only way that they will turn you down is if you are gay. The kind of ironic part is that upwards of 50% of Catholic priests are gay. And that's John Cousins, may he rest in peace. That's a fact. So, if that's the culture itself, not just from the top, but coming up from the bottom, is conservative. So we're starting to run out of time. Are there one last question, and we'll wrap things up. How about that? Yeah. So talkative there.
I know, I had a friend who called the Pope a heretic. He said, it's like, you have heretics before, as popes. Is this a sense, and that those white nationalists can believe that it's the Pope who's out of line, and that their views and their stances are the ones that are.
They're the true, holy, and faithful Catholics. Does he go to Latin Mass too?
I have to ask him.
Okay.
Probably. Yeah. It's a Vatican I down.
Right, exactly. But yes, that's so when you have this soft schism, and this is a perfect ending. Right, and these bishops speaking out against Pope Francis directly, they're thinking, well, he's in the wrong, right? He said, well, I had surgery and I had people praying for my death, right? They want him out of the way. They just think that they can bide their time, and then the next pope will, be more in line with their views. Yeah, I mean, they call him all sorts of things. And it used to be that you weren't allowed to criticize the Pope, but now it's very in vogue in a lot of places.
And
Yes, Burley, I'll give you the last word.
part of it's weird because there is an old pope still, you know.
Yes. And that's not said out loud, but I think some people in their heads are like, oh, well, Benedict really, he's still Pope. But no one says that out loud, but I wonder. That's okay. Well, that was fun, huh? Thank you. I appreciate it.